Communications Director for Tri-Faith Initiative. I'm glad you're here. And sorry, I am still letting folks in. But I just wanted to say welcome and thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike and Jeff.
Great. Well, thanks, Sierra, and welcome to week 4, everybody, the penultimate week of this book study. So we're getting to the last couple chapters. And so what I'll do here, just kind of at the top of the discussion, is let's give a brief overview of the chapters. We had chapter 9 and 10 this week. Then I'll kick it over to Jeff to maybe ask an introductory question or two, and then we'll introduce our guest for this evening, Barry Thomas from Omaha Public Schools, which we're super excited about. So first of all, chapter 9 and 10, you really see the author piling on the evidence for the distinction between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. In the chapter 9, we sort of see this thread of other government actors really kind of having a role in maintaining segregation in communities, whether that's through the police or the story of the mailman, really kind of discovering, I guess, an integrating neighborhood. But then also kind of how those actors intersect with the policies that we saw in the past, how as neighborhoods integrated following the segregation that was really kind of provided for through FHA and the VA lending requirements, you see that sort of the way neighborhoods and community associations reacted was really kind of protected by actors such as the police and this idea of the mob violence and things that kind of were experienced by people in transitioning neighborhoods. And so, we see again kind of this sort of perfect storm of government actors, private citizens, community organizations, nonprofit organizations, really kind of maintaining these ideas of segregation in communities and really fostering segregation in communities. So then moving to chapter 10, really this chapter is kind of about suppressed incomes, and sort of the interesting thread, I think, in this chapter is that, we have the de facto argument that a lot of segregation is caused by income gaps, and the author sort of accepts that on the face of it and says, but if we accept that rationale, then we have to really think about where those income gaps came from. And as you that have read the chapter, you see that a lot of those income gaps are connected to government policy. And then again, back to this idea of de jure versus de facto segregation, that we see sort of this almost circular sort of relationship between the suppression of incomes and sort of maintaining and perpetuating segregation. And so then, we see home ownership, kind of the things that we talked about in the previous chapters as one thread of that, but then also the author connects it back to, many of the things we discussed in the first week, where you had Jim Crow policies, you had vagrancy laws really criminalizing Blackness in the South, really leading to parts of the Great Migration, sharecropping, and in the way that was an exploitative relationship, really kind of leading to things like the Great Migration and this transition to northern cities. And then Black families met with many of the sort of employment-related discrimination that we discussed in earlier weeks as well. And so we really see this kind of connection back through the decades, through all of the different chapters, all these different threads. Really, these chapters to me read a lot like kind of just summing up of a lot of these different ideas and giving a few anecdotes to really kind of, tie a lot of these threads together. But I thought kind of at the tail end, when they started to discuss some of these additional New Deal policies that really kind of piled on, the restrictions or access to opportunity for Black families, through, the minimum wage requirements, having carve-outs for agriculture and domestic workers, where in the South, those were predominantly Black professions. The National Labor Relations Board removing requirements that labor unions that segregate not have access to collective bargaining rights. And really many of the sort of compromises that I guess the author would call them between sort of, New Deal leaders and Southern Democrats really being at the expense of opportunity for Black families. And so these chapters, a little bit shorter this week, kind of getting to the tail end of the the reading here, but really I think kind of just another stack of evidence to really, kind of play out the author's main thesis, which is this idea of de jure versus de facto segregation. So with that, I'll toss it over to Jeff, and if there's sort of any initial questions, we'll start there. But other than that, Jeff, I'll let you take it away.
Thanks. I was just thinking about, I recall when Richard Rothstein came to Omaha a year and a half ago or so and spoke at Creighton University. He told the story of the Wade family in Kentucky and that mob violence. And I just remember the room sort of that seemed to they responded kind of in disbelief. I was just curious from like this group if you had similar kind of, as we have the luxury of kind of reading the book and seeing the build up to this, but if that was something that surprised you, or these stories of state-sanctioned violence, is that something that was surprising to you, or does it kind of fit into the narrative of what we've been seeing lately?
I didn't really find a lot of the references to violence and acts against Blacks surprising, but what has continuously surprised me is government support of those activities. That's what's really sunk in as to how difficult government has made it and how significantly we've let down the Black community based on the 14th Amendment.
Right. But anyone else? Any other thoughts on these chapters before we listen to Barry and have a conversation with Mr. Thomas?
You know, I think it was. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think my thought would be, well, that wouldn't happen here, but I remember being in Chicago in the late 60s when that was going on in Cicero. And so that makes me less willing to say that can happen here.
For me, I'd be much more surprised a few years ago than what I am now. I have seen, as an old white fat lady, I'm not right out on the street corner like I used to be, but I have seen police just, I was at 72nd and Cass, May 30th. They said to disband within seconds. I mean seconds. 10, 15 seconds. They then started throwing tear gas and rubber bullets. I mean, rubber bullets were immediately bouncing off my car into the parking lot that they were wanting people to get into their cars and leave. So there's a hell of a lot of shit going on in Omaha right now, I fear.
Sorry for that experience that you had, Jane. I think if we can hear from Jonathan, I think you're about to chime in, and then after that, we'll move over to Barry.
You know, I'm not surprised so much that the things that he offers examples of in the book happened, but now there's an explanation as to why they happened the way that they happened, and it just seems to me that huge chunks of the Constitution have been serially just disregarded completely without any consequence whatsoever, and that is the ultimate in terms of privilege, that people can employ their interpretation, their version of the Constitution in service of their own personal kind of wealth accumulation. And like I said, I know that my family was discriminated against. I didn't think that I was growing up in California, but now reading it makes sense. It explains so much of what I was seeing and going on around me. In spite of the fact that we lived in a fully integrated neighborhood, I think we were especially fortunate to have that be a feature in my life. But I know for a lot of people, a lot of my members of my family, that they never had that. That was never a part of their lives, and it did change the entire trajectory of my immediate family's life. Being afforded that opportunity, and I just think I shudder to think what the world would look like if everybody else would have been extended the same opportunities.
That's right.
I'd be a lot better. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. We think about that. Equity as a growth model for the region, the economy. Yes. So I wanted now to kind of transition. Actually, right before we do that, I just want to let everybody know next week, August 4th, we'll have Alexis Bromley as our guest speaker. And Alexis Bromley is the director of One Omaha, which stands for the Office of Neighborhood Engagement. And the last couple of chapters talk about sort of looking forward. And she has a lot of experience in redevelopment projects and kind of community-based initiatives. And so she'll be here to talk with us. But for now, we're very fortunate to have Barry Thomas with us tonight. As a number of our conversations over the last few weeks, the role of school, the education system, our own educational upbringing, and how that shaped the way we view things, and then what it might mean to undo some of those structures and what we've learned to move forward. And the role of evictions and school choice. These are all, everything is so intertwined here. So we, thankfully, Wendy Goldberg was able to reach out to Barry, and he's able to make time. And actually, Barry, I was just on a meeting with you earlier tonight on, you're a busy, very busy person, with the social and emotional support for families and children in OPS is for all the parents. So thank you for organizing that and being a part of it. But for now, I just want to pass over to Barry to give an overview of himself and the role as the director of equity and diversity for Omaha Public Schools. And then and we'll have a Q&A. And I have a few questions in case we stall out, but I have a feeling we won't stall out for time with Barry. So just want to again thank you to Barry for being with us tonight, and we'll pass it over to you.
Sure thing, and thank you to Wendy Goldberg and Tri-Faith, and Jeff. Thank you for being willing to collaborate, and all of you lovely people who are taking this dive into some really, really, really dangerous waters when you start talking about the covert. As you were saying, the facto versus the jure, just that book, my God, that book opened my eyes to so very much that we just don't discuss. You learn about Jim Crow. You learn about Plessy v. Ferguson and, all those different policies. You learn about black codes. You learn about all those different kind of high level stuff that the big policy, the government puts down, right? The federal government puts down. But man, when you get into the weeds of banking and real estate practices, and in our case in education, and you start recognizing when people talk about systemic racism to perpetuate white supremacy, that is a very real thing in so many different arenas of all of our lives. And as Dr. Benjamin Alvarado was making reference to, just like the eye-opening of how it impacts your circumstances, and the need for that revelation, for everybody, not just Black folks, not just brown folks, but for white folks, for all folks, to have the revelation of the reality of, like, Social Security was so manipulated. And I don't know, I think you said you were on chapter 9 or chapter 10, so this may be spoiler alert. I'm not sure if you've gotten to that point yet, but I don't remember where it was in the chapters. But you know, to be that detailed about Social Security, to where you exclude the careers and the professions that are most commonly held by Black people, that people that are busboys and shoe shines and women that go and do housework, there's no Social Security for them, and that's intentional and that's purposeful, to keep their hand out of the pot and to make that pot a lot bigger for other folks. And so the interesting thing about my work, you know, just kind of a braiding of the conversation here, the interesting thing about my work is the work that was it Rich Rothstein? Is that what it is? Rich Rothstein? Okay.
That's
so
right.
the work that he didn't even set out to do, right? I think he was just a journalist that was getting ready to cover some kind of story and ended up falling into this path. Like, it is so difficult to bring that truth to light. This man has spent a generation really digging in. And so my job as the director of equity and diversity is to essentially pull a Rothstein for Omaha Public Schools and look at what policies we've had that came about during the 1960s or 1950s that have held true in our school district, right? To maintain that inferiority of the others and the marginalized, and the superiority of our white students. I have to go and now try to figure out, okay, first I got to find it, which is the trickiest part, because in the middle of that, we got civil unrest taking place, and I got to send out letters to talk about what OPS's stance is with Black Lives Matter. And then we got, you know, Supreme Court decisions that says transgender is okay now based off, you know, so I got to go out and I got to navigate all those things. And so it's a distraction to kind of dig into the weeds of board policy and school practices and curriculum that have these inequitable outcomes for our students and our families and our community. It's my responsibility to not only dig those out, but then also try to develop policies to counter the impacts of those policies. And that it's a heavy, heavy lift. Now, I'm fortunate. I am truly fortunate to where I have a school board, I have a superintendent, and I got a bunch of really bright colleagues that make it so I don't have to do that lifting by myself. But we all have a lot on our plate. You know, then you throw a COVID in the situation, and man, those policies become so much more evident. That red line gets a lot redder when you start throwing illnesses and you see 70% disproportionality of our Hispanic Latinx babies and communities and families are being hit where they're only 17% of the overall population. How does that work? Because the streets are smaller, the houses are tighter. They've been packed into these homes on top of, because that's the traditional places, because that's where our real estate agents, that's where our businesses and our banks loan money to set up businesses. That's where entrepreneurship is allowed to breathe. And so all of these things get, you know, multiplied exponentially when tragedy strikes. And trying to get our students to understand there's a narrative, there's a self-esteem concern when you don't understand why the walls are so tight on you and not on everybody else. I'm going to read something real quick. This is from an article from Teaching Tolerance, just a real quick little paragraph. And I'm going to give you the title. The title of the article is Debunking the Mobility Myth. And as you talk about education in the context of the color of law, I think this article, Debunking the Mobility Myth, is a great indicator of some work that we have to do in education to help our students' emotional development along with our educational development. I'll just give you just a real quick piece here, and one of the subtopics is the myth of the American dream. Okay, the myth of the American dream, and there's a quote here that says, "It may feel harsh or unkind to tell Black students that they won't be afforded the same opportunities as some of their fellow citizens. But honestly, engaging them about the limitations of their social positions can help them understand that the barriers they face are real. I talked to I'll end this with this real quick narrative, and then we can kind of get into the steak and potatoes of your questions there, Jeff. I had a life-changing conversation with my mother last week. My mother is, she's older than me. I'll just, I will put it that way. I don't want y'all to get back to her and say, your son said how old you were in a group of strangers. So I will say it this way. My mom was born in Omaha before the interstate was built. How about that? Okay, as a point of reference. And I was talking to her, we were talking about family secrets last Friday, and she, the kids talk about spilling the tea, which is like giving up all the business. And she was spilling gallons of tea last week in this conversation that we had. And so we got around to talking about my father. And my father was around until I was about 11 or 12. He was around till I was about 11 or 12, but he had started dealing with he had started battling drug addiction in like 88, 89, became addicted to crack. And then ended up breaking, they split up, and we ended up moving back home to Omaha with my mother's side of the family. And so I was kind of asking, I was like, you ever wonder what happened? Like, how do you, I remember being a kid seeing the guy frying the eggs in the pan, talking about this is your brain on drug, DARE programs, and everybody knew crack was this horrible thing. I wonder, I was like, I wonder why he ended up getting addicted to crack. And, my mom said he just wanted to get high. He wanted to be high. And I said, okay, I can, kind of think about some of the trauma that he endured as a young man that I've come to find out about. I can understand why he was struggling when he had some struggles with some depression and some mental illness that, some certain people go to church to deal with their issues, and certain people don't. And my dad was a don't, right? And so he ended up getting addicted to drugs to kind of deal with his pain. And I said, yeah, so I kind of brought that into context. And she said, yeah, he did have a hard childhood, but he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to go that route. And I said, well, let's think about the 80s for a moment. Let's put some context around the 80s. I said, you got the Reagan administration from 80 to 88. And at that same time, you have the unleashing legally tied to the Iran-Contra scandal of crack cocaine into Black communities and brown communities throughout the entire United States under the government's nose, under the government's watch, with permission. You can go Google that because I don't want to spend too much time on the Iran-Contra scandal, but I need you to understand that there were actual policies put in place to where crack cocaine was pushed into Black communities, and Black folks were put to blame for that. Welfare mom, lazy, don't want to work men. Meanwhile, you know, Reagan's busting up unions, leading to higher unemployment. Companies are moving outside the United States. So for a guy to find a job, it's tough times. For you to have some rights on the job to get equal pay or higher pay, it's tough times. So I say all that to say, my dad, my father, in the midst of all of that, you know, we make our own choices without question. We make our own choices, but the economic system is what provides us the choices we have to make, the determination between. You know, somebody set the table. He didn't cook anything. And listening to, or I should say reading The Color of Law helps me to tell my mother what this quote says about your self-esteem if you're a Black person. Because you can put that blame, everybody else does, right? Everybody else puts the blame on the Black people. And so it's easy to internalize that. But we have to educate our students about the truth, about policies and practices, acts and resolutions, from the federal government to the city government to our institutions, all throughout criminal justice, education, everywhere you look. Everywhere you look, it's all evident of the color of law, of these purposeful, strategic, inequitable policies that lead to disenfranchisement, police aggression, prison mass population, mass incarceration, education achievement gap, health disparities. Everywhere you look. And if you get to understand how those things came about, for me, it gives me clarity of my family through the Reagan administration, through the Nixon administration with his war on crime, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, the hero of the Voting Rights Act, and his war on crime that set up Nixon to continue that on, to the Jim Crow era, to sharecropping, all, obviously enslavement of Black people, all is written right in front of you. And if you get to understand that, you understand not just how cruel the society has been, but how strong your people are. Not perfect, but survived. Not flawless, bruised, broken, maimed, burned, but survived. And if you understand that, I can get through anything because of my ancestors. That's the color of law, and that's the work that we have to do in education to make sure that all of our students understand how our society got to where it is so that we can start unraveling this thing to making it more equitable. So that's my job. That's what I do for Omaha Public Schools.
Barry, that was incredible. Thank you. I think we just had like a graduate class in urban studies and in educational leadership all right there. in about 15 minutes. Thank you. I want to ask a question. You talked about these things are explicit and implicit. This kind of de facto, de jure. One thing I'm kind of curious about. I mean, this is about how the book. I mean, it's about so many things, but housing in particular, and our current situation. You have on one hand families that are looking for home ownership opportunities. They're in the market, and there's like this prevalence of the idea of I just want to live in a neighborhood with good schools, and that, you know, what that may or may not be really saying, a family may or may not be really saying. And then on the other hand, on like another side of the community, we have maybe unplanned family mobility due to evictions. And last week we showed a story map of Creighton University. They've been mapping evictions and tracking that over time with schools, and the OPS schools with the highest rates of evictions mobility are the same neighborhoods that are the highest concentration of, you know, racial concentration and neighborhoods in census tracts of poverty. So those things seem to be kind of invisible. Like students are impacted by both that idea of I want to live in a neighborhood with good schools, or our family has to move around because you are being evicted. That, you know, both of those have an impact on educational outcomes. So I'm curious from a school district, kind of what you're doing and what the role in conversations about locational choice and family stability and housing stability, and what you can do about that.
Yeah, so you can see that in a lot of the decisions that are really evident. First, you look at the bond that we're building these new schools, right? And so the hope is that we're building these new schools and helping to spread out specifically our. Sorry, my daughter she's on a conference call going down the steps and I didn't want it to overlap. So you look at like our grossly overpopulated schools in South Omaha and what that might mean as far as with, you know, what you're speaking to, which is, you know, how often are students getting the absolute services that we can provide if there's a scarcity of staff in certain schools and a scarcity of, or excuse me, and a surplus of students in certain schools. So you look at South High, the most populated school in the state of Nebraska, given on, you know, if it's a Monday or a Wednesday between South and Central. I'll give it to South. I'm an alumni, so I'll give it to South. And so you look at a South High School where we have some fantastic, absolutely fantastic programming in that school. We've got an Educators Rising program that gets our students at South High are getting trained on taking dual enrollment classes at UNO in teacher education so that we can start getting them prepared to be the next teachers in our school district, right? Or you look at our dual language program where, and my daughter is a part of the dual language program where students are learning half of their content in English and the other half of the content in Spanish. And so you're accommodating for your English learners and giving them rigorous courses while also giving your Spanish learners rigorous courses by adding some multiple perspectives and challenges about language acquisition as they do the work. And they get this lovely, lovely certificate from the government of, or the consulate of Spain to kind of certify that they have this recognition, and it sets them apart like an IB type of a thing, right? So you have these wonderful programs that are afforded in these spots, but not everybody has access to them. And so we have to make sure that we do things to try to support that growth and incorporating as many as we can into those programs. Now, you know, if we could talk plainly about this deal, South Omaha is growing in population and there's a need there for a new high school, a new middle school, some new elementaries, and expanding some of our elementaries with additional rooms and construction. So going into, you know, the color of law here, policy wise, what do we need to do? We need to get a bond. Well, how do we get people to vote for a bond to support our students in South Omaha with this high mobility issue, or with the language acquisition of being assimilated into English learning classrooms and all that? Well, how do we get people across or outside of South Omaha to buy in? The need in itself should be enough, right? The fact that we say we got 1,000 more kids in the school than what we should, that should say something to people, right? But politics is, okay, so if you want a new high school in South Omaha, we want to put a new high school in Northwest Omaha.
Hey, Barry, I want to raise a point there, because I live in South Omaha.
Yes, sir.
I used to live in South Omaha, and I agree with everything that you're talking about, and yet what you're describing is completely by design in terms of the material condition that people find themselves living in this community. The vast majority of homes, even though they were built as single-family homes in South Omaha, are zoned as multi-family units. And so landlords carve those houses up. You've got in a house, that maybe optimally for 7 or 8 people, you've got perhaps 15 to 20 living, and all their cars on the street and all the trash that they produce. And, and then the fact that they're being significantly impacted by COVID and a lot of other health conditions as a consequence to that. So even building another school for South Omaha does not address the material condition that's been created by property owners. And, and I know a few of the property owners that own some of the homes near where I live, and they live nowhere near this neighborhood, and yet they're the beneficiaries because the home was paid for, the deed was done 30 years ago, and they've just been collecting rent all this time and not doing very much of anything at all to improve the material condition of people living in the community. And so there is this disparity, and it's always been this way in South. It's been this way since World War II. They needed to have it zoned this way so they could have enough workers to, in meat packing back then. It was the necessity, but we've not moved off of that since 1945. So, which is absolute insanity that you're going on something that's nearly 75 years old and not ever having done a damn thing to improve the material condition of people living here. And it's fortunate for the community that it's on the upswing. You have entrepreneurs and all the good things that you mentioned. And yet, like I said, I applaud the effort of the public schools to meet the challenge. And I think you've done a really good job here. I'm happy to say that my neighbors on both sides, their children are college graduates, and they're doing remarkable things. But the material condition of the vast majority of people here is still hard scrabble and hand to mouth, and it isn't getting any better. And that's by design.
And so I'm trying to say how within the district we have to wiggle around what you just explained, right? So within the district we have to play the political game in order to get some sorts of advancement for those in most desperate need. And I was just listening to Dr. Gloria, what is it, Lance Billings. Benjamin, you might be able to help me out with that. I'll get her name before we get done. I think it's Gloria Latson Billings is the author of talking about culturally responsive teaching. And she said something about when the only way that we've been able to successfully make policies change in support of people of color or marginalized people is when the incentive for white populations aligns with the needs of those marginalized populations. And so that's the larger point that I'm trying to draw in here is, Brown v. Board, I see you, Jeff, I'm coming. Brown v. Board worked because we were in a Cold War and we couldn't look that bad about treating our people that poorly globally when Russia's up against us, right? And so you get the momentous decision of Brown v. Board, but then at the same time, schools are still segregated today because the education itself is not the issue. It's what we've now outlined with the color of law. So, you know, there's a lot to respond to as far as with the achievement gap and what you just spoke to right there. I would say for people that are looking for schools, for people that are looking for or moving into homes based off of the good schools, I'm shocked with how many people who have actually graduated from Omaha Public Schools still hold on to this negative perception about their own education and don't have the willingness to invest back within their own schools, which got them to whatever modicum of success that they've attained. A lot of it can be attributed to the education that they received in OPS. Our schools deal with things that no one else can deal with. Battle tested, tried and true. There is nothing comparable to the diversity, to the rich culture of the students that we have in our school district and the teachers that serve them dutifully. I'll put us up against anybody, but if you're looking for numbers, Jeff, I'm ending right here. If you're looking for numbers to validate that success, please be careful about what you're using for the measuring rod. If you're looking at standardized test results, look at the history of standardized tests and where they came from. IQ test all the way to University of Texas saying we got to do something crafty to make it so these Black kids can't come into this college. Let's make a standardized test. Those things are rooted in racism. And so the numbers are going to reflect what the system is designed for them to reflect.
Could I just add an amen here to what you said? I'm a speech pathologist in South Omaha at Bancroft Elementary, and everything you said is the way it is. And I love my job and I love the school I'm at. So I'm really grateful for what you're doing. Thank you.
I'm grateful for you, Kay. You're the trenches out there doing that hard work, working with them babies. Thank you.
Yeah, and they're awesome kids. Thanks.
Awesome. Salt of the earth.
Barry, can I ask you a question? I'm also a public educator. I teach in Bellevue. And so this isn't specifically like to a lot of what we read in Color of Law, but you were mentioning about how we need to be teaching our BIPOC students, you know, to have the self-esteem. And a conversation that I've been having with my fellow white educators in my building, those of us who are concerned about how we're creating classrooms which amplify and elevate those voices and to help our kids. So it's kind of like I'm struggling with this idea of assimilationist versus anti-racist in my classroom. And I just kind of wondering what your opinion is from your role, because obviously for our kids to be successful, society has deemed that there are specific ways that you need to act. And obviously those behaviors and the culture that we deem appropriate is not representative of where they're coming from. So do you have any suggestions on how we can kind of balance being assimilationist to help them navigate the current society, but still them feel like we're listening to their voices?
Absolutely. So let me not give you like the definitive response there is, but
or resources that you all have found that have been helpful. I'm really struggling because I always thought like assimilationist, yes, I'm doing a good job. And then I realized after reading some stuff this summer, I'm like, oh, criminy.
Yeah, Larissa, you asked what resources, you are the resource. I have to put it back on people who have figured this thing out. So you have figured out that standardized carbon copy content standards driven, formative summative assessment, all that jargon, race to the top versus no child left behind, and whatever else that we have as our accountability within how we go about doing our work. You figured out, oh wait, this is just to get all this cookie cutter crap going. Who the hell who wants this cookie cutter crap, right? And so my challenge to you is play the game, right? So you talk about the assimilationist versus the anti-racist. So right now you have to work within the parameters of the policies that are put forth by your school and by the state of Nebraska Department of Education. But those things can change. I've recently found out that there's this Teachers for Black Lives Facebook group that's been organizing to do some stuff about school. I think some of the same stuff, Larissa, that you're speaking to. Just some of those needs of institutional and structural changes within our schools. There's a whole building that's unicameral in Lincoln, Nebraska, where they create state statutes that dictate what happens in our classrooms. They were last week, I want to say, I think it was early last week, they were trying to give teachers the ability to act aggressively to restrain students. And we know who's going to be the recipients of that aggression. That's policy that the Education Committee, the chair, Senator Groney, put before the unicameral, not once, not twice, not 3 times, 4 times. At my last count, that's a policy decision that you, Larissa, and your colleagues have the ability to say, get the hell out of here with this. What are you talking about? The same as standardized test. What's good for our kids? Groney's never taught a day in his life. Not sure if he's ever learned. Let me stop. So just understand, you are the answer. If you want to get rid of this mess, you go volunteer for the Nebraska Department of Education. They actually pay you, if you're a teacher, to go rewrite the standards. I did it. Jonathan helped me out. There's a reason why marginalized populations is in the state standards for social studies right now. There's a reason why LGBTQIA2S+ is in the state standards for social studies right now. It's because you have to be a part of the solution to create the change. So you and your friends that have been having these conversations can take this. This is social justice. Take ownership of what we are doing to our kids. And if you want to move from assimilationist to anti-racist, you convince your school board, your principal, and even if you don't want to do the politics stuff, sneak into one of those curriculum writing teams. Or sneak into one of those, textbook review teams. Find your way on one of these committees that's making some decisions about, whatever your version of behavior programming for. We have MTSSB in Omaha Public Schools, but whatever your version is, be a part of that and bring this conversation to that work, and then the change happens. But it won't unless, it's going to stay assimilationist unless Larissa and her crew, and Barry and my crew, and Jeff and his crew, and Kay and her crew, unless all of us decide to put our pedal to the metal and get in the fight, and not stand out and say, what are we going to do about it? You're the resource, Larissa.
Thank you, Barry. I know you have a hard stop at 8 o'clock, I think.
Oh, yeah, geez.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So
if I get out of it, hold on real quick.
But I just want to make sure we have time. If anyone else has a question for Barry, this would be the right time to do it.
So you just brought up the social studies curriculum changes that were made at the state level. I think that was back in November of this last year. And there was a newspaper article I think about the Millard administrators reading White Fragility and how they were reviewing some of their social studies curriculum. Could you talk a little bit about, how districts, maybe even districts across the state, it might not even just be OPS specifically, but, kind of what sort of latitude at the local level they have to implement some of that new social studies curriculum? Because that is one thing that the author highlights, is that what's in our textbooks doesn't tell the story of segregation in a way that connects with people and their experience today.
So I'll end, Mike, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. So I'll end on that note, on that question, because I think it sums up the work that we need to do perfectly. I was the beneficiary. When I was supervisor of social studies for Omaha Public Schools, I walked into a program that my predecessor had organized called Making Invisible History Visible. Okay, if you're not familiar with that program, Sierra, is that you dropping links in the chat, or somebody else doing that? I saw somebody dropping links, but
yeah.
We're
all doing it.
Okay, so Invisible History invisiblehistory.ops.org, I think is the website. We created our own curriculum. We had our students study, and let me just to kind of give you the premise, Omaha is rich with a lot of different culture. We've talked about that, right? But that culture is not in the pages of the books that our students are studying. And if it is, it may be misrepresented. And so my predecessor, Harris Payne, just retired from the Department of Education, as a matter of fact, he had this idea like to get kids to go out and be the researchers, to be the historians, to tell the stories that aren't told about the minority, or I should say, I like to say marginalized populations, global majority when you talk about people of color. So to talk about marginalized populations in the city of Omaha and the contributions, and if not just the contributions, but the wealth of culture that we have in this city. And so we set out to putting kids in groups of 3 or 5 with a teacher, with a university student, and with a college professor or content, and we connected people with the community and compiled narratives and stories and put those things, kind of like what Benjamin and I were talking about, with just kind of our lived experiences with the backdrop of what all was going on in the broader society. We put those things together, and you've got a plethora of standards aligned, Mike, this to your question here, of standards aligned curriculum, content, resources that deal with our cultures. Anybody and everybody. I'm when I went to Wayne State, I remember driving through some town in between here, Omaha and Wayne. This is a big Danish population. I can't remember what the name of the town is, but I would walk by, or I would drive by, and I'd see this big Danish festival sign that they kept up there. That Danish culture, that German culture in this state, there's some rich cultures in our state that aren't in our books. So it's not just black, brown. It's what country in Europe. We need to all be able to embrace these stories. And so as you talk about throughout the state of Nebraska, you got El Salvadorian kiddos, you got Mexican kiddos, you got Native American tribal babies, our Umaha, our Ponca. They all have to be able to connect to our curriculum, and our standards are written so that they're inquiry focused, so that students can ask questions and then learn how to research them on their own. And so with that, how the social studies standards are written, it's not George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. So it's inquiry focused, so that kids are learning how to develop questions, learning how to connect disciplines, geography, history, economics, poli-sci, how those people think differently based off of their training. Mm-hmm. That informs how you answer questions, mm-hmm. right? So, Dr. Benjamin Alvarado's a poli-sci guy. If I'm, he does everything, but I know he's got some poli-sci in there. I've sat through some of his lectures. I'm an econ guy. And so he thinks about things differently because of his poli-sci training than I do with my econ training. But that's diversity of thought, which is different than a historian's thinking, which is different than a geographer's thinking. Mm-hmm. And so you get the kids to ask questions and then you have them think about it. Okay, how would a geographer answer that question? Mm-hmm. That's a standard.
You know, Mike, the one thing that was really interesting about this process, because there were also other professors across the state of Nebraska that were a part of this, in addition to high school administrators. What we wanted to do was give all the school districts the latitude to ask the questions. And the more important consideration that I had, the thing that nagged me as I walked out the door after participating in this wonderful experience, because it's the first time it had ever been done in the state. I have to tip of the hat to both Barry, but to Harris Payne for convening all these people, was that how are we going to resource it? How are we going to give those classroom instructors the materials and the resources that they needed to be able to share their wisdom and their knowledge with their students? It still nags me to this day, because I'm thinking about it. I said, you know, and we can refer them to certain things, and I'm happy for the internet because it allows for there to be more sources and what have you. But that still is the big issue. And I think to Barry's point, there's people at the unicameral that have no idea. And we're talking, there's also a rich diversity of political perspectives and partisanship as a part of that group as well. I mean, we were not on the same page on a lot of things, but we agreed to talk to what was best for our children.
Yes.
Barry, I just wanted
I'm sorry, Gail, I heard you. Give me just a quick second to finish this.
Okay.
So back to Larissa, as Dr. Benjamin Alvarado talks about getting engaged and getting involved in that process, and how how much rewarding, how rich that was. I want that so much for you. I want that so much for you.
I teach world language. We just did new standards and it's great. And I'm so excited, but we haven't adopted them yet in my district. So I'm just like, COVID's given me the opportunity to pilot things. Yep. So like, the whole book goes out the window this year.
There you go. There you go. As well it should. Dagnam books.
Barry, I just wanted to say thank you for all you shared. I've known Harris Payne a lot of years. I'm a geographer who just retired last week after 32 years of firsthand mapping and then GIS and training interns and being involved with Nebraska GIS, LIS. And so I didn't know he was leaving, and he's an amazing man. You have big shoes to fill, but it looks like you're doing a fantastic job doing it. So I just wanted to say it's nice to meet you, Barry.
Nice to meet you as well, Gail. And next time you run into Harris, Facebook or in person, just make sure you tell him that I was bragging on him.
Well, it's hard to do anything but brag on Harris Payne, because he is a remarkable man. That I actually had him as a student at UNO, and he teaches people to think, and he's just a gifted teacher. But it's very nice to meet you, Barry.
Nice to meet you as well, and nice to meet all of you. I know I'm at 8 o'clock, right? 8:02 right now. I'm not hosting this next meeting, so I can just kind of mosey in. But Jeff, Wendy, if there's nothing else, I really do. I appreciate this conversation. My goodness, I know that's a bit like, I don't know, conceited talk about you appreciate the conversation when you've been running your mouth all the day now. But the thought. And the group to having these talks. I appreciate the fact that you're hosting these conversations. Let me say it that way. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here.
High demand. So we really appreciate your time with us tonight.
All right, you got it. Take care, everybody. Best wishes.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next week.